On Rebuilders today, we are taking a look around the world. It's been a while since we've caught up, so we're going to be chatting about what's been happening and also having a look at one element of the grey zone where two contradictory things are happening at the same time. What are you most excited about talking about, Mark?
Well, first of all, I'm excited to be back.
Yes.
And talk about these things. Lots of things observing around the world. I've been overseas for the first time in 2.5 years. So just great to take that big picture view, what's happening in the world, catch people up, perhaps give some people some language to understand some of the crazy things we seem to be seeing out in the world at the moment and getting our heads around all of it.
Great. Well, we look forward to sharing the episode with you. If you are wanting more information about the books or resources that we mention in this episode, you can join our subscriber list by heading to rebuilders.co. Let's get into it. Well, hi, welcome to Rebuilders. My name's Liddy. I'm here with Mark and Daniel. Welcome back, guys.
Good to be back. Good to be back in the saddle.
Great to be back. Sorry, I'm looking at my screen here and I can see your cup with which once was black and now is slowly fading. You can see reappearing church reappearing on the cup. Sorry, side point. But it's good to be back.
It is.
Welcome.
Yes.
Well, I think we put it in the dishwasher when you're not meant to put the cup in the dishwasher.
Yeah. Aren't you? Did it come with rules?
Well, for those who don't know what we're talking about, it was an incredible cup that we had a bunch of them, which
say no more
was black. But then when you poured hot drink into it, the reappearing church cover logo came up.
Yeah.
There's a heat sort of sensor, but it's on it. I remember them saying, "Don't put in the dishwasher," which has obviously happened, and now it's just neither. It's just a sad in
situation.
It's a grey zone.
It's
yeah.
Zing. Hey, big news.
What?
We've all had COVID now.
We've all had COVID now.
We've all had COVID.
Yep.
Yeah. Not post-COVID, but COVID experiencers.
Yeah, tell us about your experience, Mark, because Daniel and I just had it in boring old Melbourne.
Yeah,
but,
I did. I am part of the UK Jubilee weekend wave. So I was speaking in the UK and was meant to check out of my hotel and head to Oxford to speak, up to Oxford, and double lines on the little test kit, and you go into that like, hang on, but I'm in a hotel. What do I do? On my flight. So yeah, it was logistical. It was logistically fun. I'll say that. So I had to end up staying in the UK until I recovered and was able to get back on a plane. But you guys were freezing back here in Melbourne.
We were
experiencing once in 40. Was it like the coldest few weeks in decades?
Yes. Yeah, and it really felt like that. I mean, some of our international listeners who are used to, snow for their winters is probably a little bit different. But for us, it was quite
I went
chillsome.
and bought a jacket, like a puffer jacket, because it was cold.
Yeah, there were a bunch of us that gave you advice on that.
Thank you. Appreciate
You're welcome.
Well, I was in delightfully warm London.
Is that a tan?
I think it is a tan. I was very tan sitting in London because also like I couldn't really go many places, but I could go. So I was across the road from Hyde Park, and I just would go across and sit in Hyde Park for like 3 hours in the sun.
Yeah.
And as an Aussie, it's sort of good to be in the Northern Hemisphere where you're like, I can be in the sun and not be afraid for my life.
Yeah.
So I lapped it up.
To lather up in SPF 500 plus.
That doesn't exist, so Daniel's making that up.
So I came back and people were like, you've had COVID, but you look so healthy. You're glowing.
Well, it's good to have you back. It's good to be back on the podcast recording. So, and given it's been a while, I think the last episode that we released was May 10th or 11th.
Something like that.
So it might be worth doing a bit of a sweep around the world to see what's happening.
Can I just say hello? I just say hello to say hello. Hello.
I just want to say hello to my friends.
It was just great to before I got COVID, I was able to just doing speaking and stuff, and I was at the Wildfires Festival, and it was just great to meet lots of rebuilders. Listeners, and I think it reminded me the sort of strange experience we have down here in Australia, and a lot of this podcast has been done in lockdown, and us, so you sort of you think it's just us three speaking in a room, But
Which
it was just
it
great
is.
it is, but
Yeah.
it also goes out into the world. So it's just great thanks to everyone who came up and said hi. And it was just really encouraging to hear how it's, connecting with people. And we're very grateful for our audience.
Yeah, absolutely. It was great to hear those stories relayed back to us here. So thank you for joining us. So now I'm going to do my sweep around the world from here in Melbourne.
Yeah.
Let's start with Ukraine. What's happening there?
Well, Ukraine war continues. And it's interesting in the sense that I think some of the sort of predictions that things would end quickly are not playing out. And in many ways, we're sort of heading towards, an ongoing sort of grinding conflict. And, Russia is very much now sort of adjusting its initial tactics and, relying quite devastatingly on lots of long-range artillery and attacking cities. And you sort of got this reality that you've got cities like Lviv, in the west of the country and even Kyiv to an extent, which, there's some semblance of normality. But then, cities in the east are really, experiencing terrible devastation. And, I think that we're at a really interesting point in the sense that I think that, people are starting to talk about Ukraine fatigue. Being in the UK, I saw a lot of, it's interesting, there's lots of Ukraine flags and saw that, even in sort of smaller places. And, there's obviously a tremendous concern around the world that with what's happening, but then also there's a stage where it's just really hard to keep it a front and center reality. And I think we're at sort of at this point too, where also at some point we'll head out of the European summer into the European winter. And I think the sort of cost of the economic cost that this is having for the rest of the world, and particularly the energy cost, which we might get onto a bit later, it's going to start to bite, and what's going to be the ongoing stomach for particularly European publics, seeing the economic upheaval around the world. The ruble's gone up, as Russia's still exporting oil. And, it's interesting. I mean, one of the other big flow-on effects as well is you're seeing on Russian TV, sort of Russian talking heads, talking about, I think one of the TV, I think it's the head of, I've forgotten her name, but she was or was the head of RT Russia Today. And she talked about, famine is our weapon now. And, some of the food and grain issues with, Russia and Ukraine, seen footage of Russian soldiers setting a fire to Ukrainian wheat fields. And, this war is going to have continuing pain for the rest of the world. Yeah. So it's not just an issue that we're all passionate about. So I think there's an element where sort of, it's not looking as clear cut as before. The ongoing cost is going to be quite tremendous. And it doesn't look like we can see any sort of resolution to this anytime soon. So the tragedy continues to unfold for the people of Ukraine. And just on a positive note, just seeing in the UK and hearing stories too, just the church. Again, I think we don't tell these stories enough. Yeah. But, stories really stepping up and churches really stepping up and providing for, Ukrainian refugees and talking to people around that. It's really inspiring. But, the cost is going to continue to be there for both the Ukrainian people, but also the rest of the world. It's going to continue to be a key dynamic affecting the future of the world.
Certainly one that, I'm keen for us to keep talking about. Let's move on to politics. Yeah. What's happening in the world of politics?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, we haven't had a conversation since our federal election here in Australia.
Oh, yes.
Which was quite interesting in the sense that we saw something similar that we've just also seen in the latest French parliamentary elections, where you've seen a real frustration with the central, sort of more centre parties, centre right, centre left. Yeah. In Australia, we've got our centre left party, the Labor Party, who ended up winning the election, but with a historic low vote. And you saw the sort of centre right party lose power after having some time in power. But it was the rise of sort of new parties and smaller parties, tremendous frustration, which we haven't seen in Australian politics that much. Interestingly, the big issue you sort of saw in the Australian election was the environment becoming a mainstream issue. And that sort of went beyond a polarisation. Often that's seen as a polarised issue, but it became almost a central issue. And even areas which traditionally have been conservative ended up voting in Green candidates. Yeah. So, you're seeing a very different political landscape. But I think one of the big takeaways from the Australian election, which I think is going to go forward into other elections, is there was no one story. Like that normally, if you think about some of the things that we've been talking about in this podcast, is the move from a era where there's a defined set of values, where particularly the era we've come from has been one of mass culture.
Yes.
And the electorate would, particularly in Australia, decide to vote this party in or decide to vote that party out. We saw different things happening all across the country.
Yeah.
You know, in Tasmania, you know, you saw the Conservative Party get in. Other parts, there was huge moves against the Conservative Party, certain types of independent parties in certain places, just stuff we'd never seen before, which was really fascinating. And, you know, again, France today, you know, just look at the news, you're seeing, you know, Emmanuel Macron having to negotiate with, you know, Marine Le Pen and, you know, the sort of far right. And I saw pictures of him talking to the Communist Party leader, and the role that I think, you know, more unconventional parties, independent parties, more extreme parties are going to play is going to be really interesting going forward. But again, what it shows you is we're going from big blocks to fragmentation.
Yes.
And little local things. There was one story I heard, I think it was a Green candidate, I think in one of the electorates in New South Wales, and people are like, oh, wow, this seat shifted. And, you know, what does this mean? And then someone just rang up and was like, actually, that one candidate was just saying that there was a new flight path over the electorate and they were campaigning on that really local issue, and that's why they won. So you saw in our election this weird thing between super local issues, but then big geopolitical issues like cost of living and, you know, so on, environment. So, yeah, I think that's sort of, you know, indicative of the way that the world is changing. It's gone from polarized or big block thinking to much more fragmented mosaic dynamics.
Yep. Finally, in the roundup, China's also been in the news.
Yes.
What's happening there?
Well, I think China, you know, there's been lots of focus on Ukraine, rightly so. But, you know, any conversation around Ukraine and Russia invading Ukraine inevitably brings us back to, you know, China.
Yep.
I saw an interview with the current head of the CIA, who's interviewed by Edward Luce of the Financial Times. I think he's the editor of the Financial Times currently. William Burns, current head of the CIA. And it was just interesting. He said, everything that's happening in Ukraine, still this US assessment is that the chief competitor to the US and the West is China. And, you know, it's been big news here in Australia, you know, of these deals that China's doing with these different, very small, some micro-states in the Pacific, like the Solomon Islands. And you're seeing this great geopolitical game going on where China as a rising competitor, you know, to the US and to the West is, you know, changing the geopolitical order. But a couple of just interesting things on that. So China's continuing approach of COVID zero is really interesting and almost a shutting off from the world. There's been a number of articles about Chinese people who have been living overseas returning home and having their passports cut as they get to the border so they can't leave. Also other stories of lots of Chinese people who are applying for passports who can't get them. So there's definitely seems to be some sort of, reports at least of the Chinese government sort of keeping its people, you know, within the country, which is fascinating. So almost so much of the story, particularly since 1989, is the story of China's integration with the world economically. That provided so many cheap things. It provided lots of money for the West, and a lot of the growth of Western countries, you know, particularly think of Australia, has been through an influx of Chinese money, buying of resources and so on. But I saw this morning in the paper, they said 70% of Chinese investment in Australia it's gone down by 70%. Another interesting fact is that, you know, it was interesting going to the UK and being in London after having not been there for a while. And I noticed, you know, there's Spanish tourists, there's some American tourists, but there's very few Chinese tourists. I don't think I saw hardly any. And in 2012, Chinese tourists overtook American tourists as the world's most traveled people. But what's different between Chinese tourists and American tourists is that Chinese tourists spent twice as much as Americans.
Wow.
So much of the global tourism sort of industry has been recently, you know, really adjusted in the last sort of, 10 years to this large amounts of Chinese, you had people rising from poverty into middle class and then spending that money around the world. But what happens if that stops and China's encouraging its people not to travel? You're getting lots of Chinese students coming home. So the big story there is the story of globalization has been really a lot about the story of China entering the global economy. But what happens if that slows significantly down? That's going to have a significant structural effect on the world. And then the ongoing story too is that the window for if China, the sort of claim of the Chinese government on Taiwan, the taking of Taiwan, which is a hugely strategic place, not just for obviously China, but in terms of chip production, supply chain issues around Taiwan, so many of the world's sort of computer chip and semiconductors are made there, that if Taiwan was to be taken by China, that would have an even more dramatic effect on the global economy than what's happening with Ukraine.
Yes.
And the window for that to happen, there's a short window that, there's many analysts saying that could happen in the next little period.
Okay.
So it could be 10 years, could be 5 years, could be 3 years. We just don't know. So that's just something else to watch that will be another significantly changing action in the way the world is going.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that update. Each of those, examples of things that are going on in the world are emblematic of what you talk about when we've been exploring this notion of the grey zone, living through the grey zone. It's disorienting. One other sort of thing that you've identified as living in a grey zone is there being sort of two contradictory or multiple contradictory things happening at the same time. And you're wanting to talk about that today. So can you explore what that means?
So one of the things I've been encouraging people to think about is software and hardware. Yeah. That we tend to be focused when it comes to cultural change on software, which I would call as ideas.
Yep.
Talk about ideas, worldview, how they change the world. And that's very true. But also I'm encouraging people to look at hardware changes, so we've looked at supply chains, we've looked at different things like that, which are more how the environment of our world changes. So there's an interplay between the ideas and the environment and the software and the hardware in which we're living in. But in grey zone, often contradictory things can happen at the same time. And one of the things I've just been thinking about, really, it's a couple of ideas that have bounced off each other in my head as I've been reading over the last sort of month is the idea that we're experiencing an acceleration in culture at the same time as a deceleration, a speed up and a slow down.
Yeah, okay.
The idea of an acceleration in culture is, often people seem like to say, they look at the news and they see certain trends and like, this is crazy. Like, where are these ideas coming from? And one of the ideas that's been spoken about with cultural change is the idea of the Overton window. The Overton window is a model of how culture changes. And so, for example, there might be a taboo, say, swearing on TV or using mild swear words on TV. As soon as that taboo is broken and say mild swear words are able to be used on TV, it's inevitable that the next taboo will then be more stringent swear words on TV.
Yes, yeah.
And, there'd be an inevitable point where someone will then question that taboo. Once that's accepted, it's like you can imagine it's like an envelope going further and further wider. And then once there's stringent swearing, will there be nudity and partial nudity, full nudity? So this has been an argument that lots of people have used about how culture changes, the moving Overton window. But what's interesting is that that tends to move slowly as there's resistance. There's people who resist change. We've talked about conservatives or traditionalists resisting change and progressives or liberals wanting to move the window in a certain direction. So it sort of plays out in this dialectic discussion and argument about how fast this should happen.
Yes.
So cultural change, happens slowly. But I read a fascinating theory which made a lot of sense to me in a book called by Mark Leonard. I'll just find the title here, which I just read, called The Age of Unpeace. Apologies for my lingering cough here. First of all, fascinating book because I read it after I only read it a couple of weeks ago and read it obviously after writing my book, but so many of the themes that I wrote about in the non-anxious presence are in this book. He's sort of termed for a grey zone. He calls, it's not war, it's not peace, it's unpeace.
Yeah.
So the book's called The Age of Unpeace. It was the Financial Times Economics Book of the Year. So there you go. And the subtitle is How Connectivity Causes Conflict. really interesting book about globalization, geopolitical order, and disorder in the world. He has one theory in there which I thought was fascinating, that the Overton window, the idea of how culture changes, we've thought about in almost a mass culture sense.
Yes.
So the example I gave, swearing on, say, network TV, where all of a sudden, I think about when I was a kid, if something happened on a network TV show that everyone watched, the next day at school, everyone knew about it.
100%.
It was like mainstream news. And the papers would report on it. It was this ongoing conversation because that's mass culture. It reaches the mass of people. And the mass of people could be reached by a few TV channels, a few newspapers, a few key magazines, a few key radio stations, or a few key, blockbuster movies. But Mark Leonard talks about what does that look like in a fragmented network digital reality? And in a fragmented network digital reality, you have this thing where everyone goes on a Facebook or a Twitter platform and everyone tries to talk, but it instantly goes into a kind of battle, as everyone's got a voice. It's not just 3 channels dictating everything. It's thousands, if not millions of channels, individual channels dictating things. And inevitably what we've seen is that we've gone from this big block of people on Facebook or Twitter to siloing.
Yes.
So they either find a subculture or niche on that platform, or they go to a whole new platform altogether, as we've seen as well. And then he asked the questions, well, what happens then when in a silo you get a bunch of people and they all think alike?
Yep.
And then how does the Overton window work in that dynamic? So, for example, in a mass culture, you've got, say, opposing voices making that process go slower. There's more of a dialectic, more of a discussion, more of a struggle. Compromises have to be made. There's debate. But if you're in a silo where everyone thinks the same, there tends to be a huge acceleration of the Overton window.
Yeah.
And actually, people want to be seen as purists and they want to be seen as, being the truest believers. If it's a bunch of—
Within the silo itself.
Within the silo itself. So if it's a bunch of conservatives, who's the most conservative? If it's a bunch of, progressives, who's the most progressives? It's a bunch of nationalists, who's the most nationalist? If it's a bunch of, globalization people, who's the most supportive of globalization? So you still have cultural change, but the sort of drag on it, the brakes, it's all accelerator, no brakes.
Yeah.
And so what happens is you have what he talks about is you have this thing where in the culture, these ideas are brewing almost at this subcultural level in these online spaces, going incredibly fast. And then they sort of pop up into the broader cultural sphere and everyone's like, oh my goodness, how have they come up with that?
Yes.
So things then move really quickly. I mean, just one example, like, there's a sort of writer in the sort of American right world, in some of the sort of the intellectuals behind Trump, a guy who was originally called he's called Mencius Mollberg or whatever, who was this online writer. It was actually a guy called Curtis Yarvin, and he wrote this article I read the other day in Unheard magazine. And so this is sort of one of the intellectual architects of Trumpism is what some people have called him. In this article, he argued effectively that, the whole modern world's gone wrong. You can trace it back to the 17th century when the Stuart kings in England should have maintained the throne. And his argument at the end is, he gets this point, like, effectively, we need to get rid of democracy. It's not working. We don't use it in companies. We don't use it in area. Why should we use it? And effectively, Prince Charles when he's king, needs to become King Charles III and effectively take over everything in a complete monarchy, and America should fold back into the British Empire. And the sort of end of this essay is sort of, the British Navy coming up the, Potomac River in Washington, D.C., sort of retaking America. What on earth?
Do you know what I mean? Make for a great Hamilton take two.
Yeah, it'd be a great movie.
Stage show.
Yeah, stage show. But it's just an example of how in an online space, ideas can go so radical so quickly.
Yeah.
Then they pop up into the space. And, I've not been following these thoughts fully. They just seem extreme. So I think what's happening is the extremes of society have siloed in terms of thought.
Yes.
And are becoming more and more radically radical. And So I think in one sense, you've got this acceleration of ideas happening at an incredible rate. And the Overton window is moving both on the left and the right, and all in many spaces at an absolutely blistering pace, which is leaving many of us, our heads absolutely spinning.
And when that happens, when there's such disparate ideas and ideologies, when they come up against each other, what happens? When they sprout out of the ground, you're like, what is this bizarre
Well, I think we're almost getting the point with polarization where it's less about, say, left and right or the two sides at each other versus the battles that are happening in the two sides. So you're seeing in the news, these arguments about places like San Francisco or Portland where the argument now is less between the right and the left as between the hard left and the sort of middle left, and particularly around issues of law and order or whatever. You're seeing a lot of American progressive institutions, like the ACLU or Planned Parenthood or whatever. It's actually battles within,
Right.
So it's less, and the same you're seeing, say, again, just look at American politics, but, it's less Republicans versus Democrats. It's who's a Republican in name only, who's, the most, so you're seeing these battles, even within the Green movement, you're seeing battles over energy and stuff like this. So I think we've moved from a phase of polarization to more fragmented world with lots of internal battles.
Yes.
And then what happens
so
is
lots
when
of silos within the one.
Yes.
What used to be one big block is now just multiple silos. Gotcha.
Now, what's interesting, I think what we're seeing is there's a realization that this is disillusioning and so distant from the mainstream. So there still is a mainstream out there. There still is a bunch of people who are not as invested in these ideas, not as invested in politics. They're living their lives. Interesting, CNN is making this big pitch now because its ratings are dropping to become more centrist.
Yes. Okay.
Hillary Clinton yesterday was making comments about sort of trans stuff, saying, look, this is an issue which affects a small amount of people. It's not going to win us elections. Let's go back to bread and butter issues. In the Australian election, you saw our Labor Party, our centre-left party, was almost running away from, quote unquote, woke issues, regardless of what they actually believed in, because they realised that the public is just tiring of a lot of this stuff.
Yes.
So there is this sense where we're in this transition moment where cost of living and a lot more bread and butter issues are coming, are really where the mainstream's at. But then you've got these very internalized battles as well. And, in some ways it's the dynamic we used to see with Twitter. People say there's a Twitter battle, doesn't affect real life. Those Twitter battles have now taken over a lot of these institutions, but still there's a point of just cultural exhaustion, I think, in the public, out there, even though people are looking, off sometimes at more, non-establishment parties. There's two things happening. There's a part of the culture who are obsessed with these battles. There's another part of the culture exhausted by these battles, another grey zone dynamic.
How do you see then, and maybe you don't have an answer to this, how do you see institutions like CNN taking a centrist approach when there are these, really extreme views, but then there are, as you said, these bread and butter views or like position. Is centrism in the middle of that, or is it just closer to the non-extremes of all of it?
I think a good way of thinking about it is it's almost we've seen the right and left spectrum as this thing, and sort of sometimes it's positioned, well, the middle is the central part, that's the best part to be because it's not extreme.
Yeah.
And maybe it's actually seeing, a different way of looking at it, where you might go, those people over there are hard left, so they're people who believe in hard left, and these people over here are more hard right, that's what they believe in, or they're more, on the environmentalist side or whatever.
Yeah.
And centrism is perhaps less centrism as it is classical liberalism or classic democratic liberalism. I just read, I've often talked about Francis Fukuyama. I just read his new book, Liberalism and Its Discontents. And really what that book is, his argument is liberal democracy is something which we've lived under and we've taken for granted. And it's actually something which isn't just neutral. It has certain values, and we need to grab onto those values and recognize the threat that comes from the extremes of the left and right.
Yes.
So it's a slightly different argument. It's less like we're just central and we don't really believe anything and we're neutral, as in, no, we actually believe something and this is what we're for. By the way, I'm not making an argument there for liberal democracy.
Right.
I'm just saying Fukuyama's argument. So I think that's actually a more honest argument.
Yeah.
I think that often what we like to do in the West is part of how power has been argued philosophically in the West is our position's the most rational, because we have this value of rationalism and reason, that, well, our position is the most rational and reasonable, and anyone who doesn't believe it must be an unenlightened, ignoramus. So, I wonder whether it's more what we're seeing as a battle between different political positions, and its centrism is really liberal democracy. It's that's really what they're trying to argue. Classical liberal democracy versus hyper-liberalism, I think John Gray's called it. So I think what CNN is realizing is probably a lot being driven by money, really.
Yes.
If you read the article, they talk about ratings and sponsors dropping off. I mean, in some ways, you've seen the same with Fox News. Fox News, as sort of the Republican thing drifted, into different territory, you've got Newsmax and I think it's America One Network, and people listen to them because Fox became too central, not as extreme as they wanted it to be. So more, I would say, probably what CNN's trying to do is not be neutral. They're actually advocating a liberal democratic position.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So we kind of almost need to steer away from binary thinking, which we're prone to in the West. So you mentioned earlier that we are exploring two contradictory things, and we've just talked about acceleration, but you also talked about the fact that we're slowing down. So the ideas are accelerating at a rapid rate, but what's slowing down?
So another book I read in the last little bit, I began to read, which I think I'm still trying to work out what I think about this, but I think it's a very provocative thesis that does accord with, I think, some of what we're seeing. It's actually a book written by Danny Dowling. We can put it in the subscriber chats, which if you're not a subscriber and you'd like to subscribe to our mailing list, please do so. We'll give details at the end of the episode.
Rebuilders.co.
His argument is history. We've talked to you before about the sort of 1989 to 2016 sort of period of culture just growing and everything seemed to be progressing and technology improving and the world becoming this smoother place. He would call that the Great Acceleration.
Okay.
So he would say, the economy was growing, technology was growing, our cities seemed to be growing, things seemed to be becoming more productive, more smoother, more efficient. His argument is we're now moving into a slowdown.
Okay.
He has a number of indices of this. He would argue that actually a lot of our technology actual improvements are more just improvements. They're not radical breakthroughs.
Yeah.
And you've heard people, Elon Musk
and stuff,
and Peter Thiel say, we thought we'd have flying cars and now we just got, Twitter or something. Or a phone is just, an iPhone is an improved computer. A smaller computer, where if you think about, say, the 1970s or 1960s, when 747s and you had breakthrough technologies. We haven't seen that in the same way. Energy, which we can talk about in a second a bit more, but the world between 1950 and 1973 went through this incredible, particularly in the developed world, this incredible growth in living standards, productivity. So much of that was actually fueled, and globalization, some of the stages of globalization. So much of that was actually fueled by 1948, the discoveries of the Saudi oil fields, which began to come online, and all of a sudden you just had this cheap oil which powered this growth. The 70s we talk about as a period of economic stagnation. Well, what happened? 1973, I think it was, OPEC, the oil cartel, actually raised the price of oil to sort of punish the West over its Israel policies. And we went into this period of stagnation, very similar to what we're having now. And so a lot of our growth is not just taken for granted. I think we've had this ideology that, the world's just going to keep growing and improving and technology is going to keep going. But that's dependent on a number of things. That's dependent on energy sources. So we're at this point where he would argue with energy, we need to move to a carbon sort of free economy and renewables. But actually we haven't found out fully the ways to do that yet. Even if you're pro doing that, it's going to cost pain to get there, and there's going to be a slowdown of the kind of life that we expect.
Yes.
He talks about the fact that almost all developed countries are absolutely cratering in their fertility rates, which inevitably will move us into social, significant social issues, as you don't have people to run things and have militaries and economies and so on. Financially, we're hitting a lot of problems in massive debt. So he's got about 10 different indices where he argues we're actually moving into a significant era of slowdown. His thing is like, it's not we're going to fall into mass poverty or anything like that. Yeah. It's just that life is not going to have the standards of living that we may have had 2010 to 2019. Yeah. Like 2019 or 2017 was possibly a peak. And even globalization, there's a lot of indices which says globalization got to a peak and now it's definitely declining.
Yes.
So I think some of the stuff we've been talking about in this structural change, I think his concept of a slowdown is capturing that. Standards of living, things are costing more, fuel's costing more. We're seeing that an interconnected global system, all we've got is a war in the Ukraine or a COVID pandemic, and all of a sudden things start to go wrong. So it's like the machine was brand new and running. It's like an electric car, a new car. You get it and everything's whiz bang. It's like a computer, but then stuff starts to go wrong after 10 years or a new fridge or something.
Yeah.
So structurally, we're slowing down. And just on this too, I think one of the big things that I'm watching at the moment is the economy. I know Daniel and I were having a chat about this, I think yesterday. There's significant, lots of people much smarter on the economy than me, are saying that we are, inevitably heading into a recession.
Yeah.
You've got a whole generation who have never really experienced a recession, particularly here in Australia, which didn't even have the effects of the 2008 GFC.
Yes.
And that's going to radically change things. So, there's a very good argument by Daniel Dorling, the Harold Mackinder head of geography at Oxford University, that we are going to head into a slowdown. So I guess my question, which I'm sort of wrestling with in my mind, what does it look like when you've got this cultural acceleration of ideas, of radical ideas, and these radical visions of how do we pull off a, utopian, progressive society of inclusion at an exact time when all of a sudden we're moving back to this much more bread and butter reality, and what's the interplay between those two things is going to be really fascinating for the world to see.
Yeah, well, watch this grey zone.
Watch this very grey space.
Yeah. Well, that's really been a big meta look at what's happening culturally in the world. In our next episode, we're going to be looking more at the trends of the church in the midst of a grey zone. How can we lead to create deeper disciples and point people to Jesus?
Yeah.
So join us next time.
Yeah.
It's been a pleasure to be back.
Great to be back.